Welcome everyone to the 9th webinar in our series on integrating with ArchivesSpace. I'm Jessica Crouch, the Community Engagement Coordinator for ArchivesSpace, and I'm joined today by Seth Shaw of University of Nevada, Las Vegas Libraries. Each webinar in this series will highlight an integration with another application used in archives that ArchivesSpace members have worked on or requested. In this webinar, Seth Shaw of University of Nevada, Las Vegas will present an ArchivesSpace integration with Drupal 8. Drupal is a popular content management system widely used for building websites and is the foundational component of the popular Islandora 8 repository software. The ArchivesSpace Drupal module allows Drupal and Islandora-based websites to present archival descriptions harvested from the ArchivesSpace API. This integration allows special collections and archives to build a single integrated interface combining both archival description from ArchivesSpace and digital objects in an Islandora 8 repository. This webinar will demonstrate how the integration works and how it can be used with Islandora 8. It will also demonstrate how it is being used at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas Special Collections and Archives in their forthcoming repository site. Your presenter today, Seth Shaw, is an application developer for the University of Nevada, Las Vegas Libraries, dedicated to special collections and archives. Previously, he was the Electronic Records Archivist for Duke University and an assistant professor of archival studies at Clayton State University. He's been developing IT solutions for special collections and archives off and on since his days as an undergraduate student. We will hold all questions until the Q&A session at the end, though if you think of a question during the session, you can type it into the Q&A panel at any time. We do ask that you type your questions into the Q&A option that you see at the bottom of your screen, not into the chat option. And with that, I'll welcome Seth and ask him to start us off. Welcome, Seth.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Hello, everyone, and welcome. We have a lot that we can talk about, and I want to leave time for questions, so we are going to jump straight into this. Now, as you are aware, Archives, the core application, has a number of different ways to interact with the application. You have the staff user interface, which most of you are very familiar with, where you create your collection descriptions, your classifications, your agent records, your subject records, your accessions, your top containers, maybe even your digital objects. That's where you work day to day in creating these descriptions of our collections. But we also have the public user interface, which is where your users, your patrons, your researchers come to find out about the materials that you have, what's in there, what's the context of these materials, and how they should get a hold of them. ArchivesSpace also has the OIPMH interface for aggregators of EAD materials, or perhaps this is how you integrate it with your catalog through harvesting of your descriptions there. We also have the API, the Advanced Programming Interface, or Application Programming Interface these days, where you can get very fine-grained control to the raw data that is being held within ArchivesSpace. Now, we, as part of this project, decided that instead of using the public user interface provided by the application itself, we would actually take a step of moving it to a different aspect where we would create a new public user interface based off of the API data. So instead of using the one built into ArchivesSpace, we would go ahead and build a new public user interface based off of the API. So keep in mind that staff are still using the staff user interface, but our researchers, the people who are coming to our site, are going to see a site, those descriptions, based off of a Drupal website. So of course you're asking yourself, why would you do this? We had a few reasons. First of all, UNLV and many libraries and archives out there already use Drupal for their libraries' websites. Along with this, our developers that we have in-house for supporting the library website know PHP, they know Drupal, they don't know Ruby, which means that it's much harder for us to try to customize the public user interface from ArchivesSpace because we aren't familiar with those frameworks. We're not as familiar with Rails and the various components that are used for customizing that website. And for our developers, for us, it's really easy to customize and extend our Drupal interface. So even if you take the ArchivesSpace public user interface and you know how to customize it using Ruby, we can also do a lot of those same customizations and extensions, if not easier. We can leverage a lot of the things that is available in the Drupal realm for customizing and extending and displaying and altering and providing access to our materials. So it made sense from a developer point of view, are familiar with Drupal, to bring that content in and to use it there. Even further, we are going to be adopting the Islandora 8 digital asset management system, which uses Drupal as a core component of that asset management system. And it made sense that if we're going to be putting our digital objects there, why don't we also bring our archival descriptions there as well, to bring it into a single site that allows us to tailor a user experience that can combine both of these, rather than having archival description in one site and our digital objects in another site, and trying to wrangle how do you connect those two together, how do you search them together, how do you make the interfaces somewhat similar to each other. We can just bring them all together and work in them in one space for our interface. So we've developed this Drupal module. So Drupal as a content management system allows you to bring in components that are developed by other groups. So like ArchivesSpace has plugins, Drupal has modules. And we created a module for Drupal for this ArchivesSpace integration. This is just a screenshot of the website. If you go here, you can report issues that you're having with it, and we can talk about things. We can move forward with how to get things working better for you. And we would love for you guys, if you joined us on this journey, to not only share what issues come up, but also contribute back your code that any developers that you have working on this may have developed, and adding features to it. So if you want to work with this integration, if you want to start playing with bringing your ArchivesSpace content into a Drupal site, you of course need a Drupal site. If you want to play with it locally, there's a lot of options. DDEV is a very common one, and it apparently works well with Windows users. It's not one that I've been using, but it is referenced on the official documentation for Drupal of setting up a local development in site. I'm actually going to be using a different system called Drupal VM for spinning up a website that I use for development a lot, creating virtual machines. Or if you are going to be using Islandora 8 as well, you can just spin up an Islandora 8 site and then use that. So however you get your Drupal, bring it up. You will also, of course, need an ArchivesSpace to bring in the source data from. You probably already have one that you can use, and it's perfectly fine to connect your ArchivesSpace, your test site, to a production ArchivesSpace, because it's just reading data. This module will not update your ArchivesSpace install. It won't change any data that's there. It'll just read all that data. So it's perfectly safe to connect this to your production ArchivesSpace site. That stated, if you want to be working with it heavily and experiment with it, it might make sense to set up a smaller test instance so that you're not spending a lot of time waiting for it to load a massive ArchivesSpace installation. So again, for this demo purpose, I've installed a smaller instance of ArchivesSpace that just has 8 different resource records. I think it totals like 7,000 archival objects in it for the purposes of this demo. So here we have just an empty, plain vanilla Drupal site. May not be that pretty up front, but you know, there's a lot of possibility here. We'll say that. And we also have the demo site of ArchivesSpace that I set up. I will mention that this demo is running on ArchivesSpace 2.7.1. I have also tested it with 2.6 and 2.5. All of those work. I haven't yet tested it with the release candidate for 2.8, but from reading the documentation, I don't think we're going to have any issues running with that as well. But now that we have our empty Drupal and we have our archive space ready to be harvested, we need to install the ArchivesSpace module. Now, Drupal uses a system called Composer for bringing in all the pieces of software that's necessary. Like I said, this is like bringing in your plugin. Whereas with ArchivesSpace, if you want to use a plugin, you have to download it, put it in the directory, and then update your configuration. With Drupal, you would enter in basically 2 commands. You would tell Composer to require this plugin, and it'll go and download all the different pieces of software that's necessary to build this plugin for you. And then you tell Drupal to enable it. That's this drush n command at the bottom, where we're going to enable this plugin. Now, this plugin is has a few different components to it. It includes both the code to interact with things, but also brings in what's referred to as configuration. We're defining a lot of fields. And because we wanted to be able to have this module work with sites that aren't using Islandora 8, or sites that are using Islandora 8 and sharing some of the key pieces and configuration of Islandora 8, we've split this into these submodules with configuration. So I'm going to enable the ArchivesSpace defaults, which will bring in things where this is just a standalone. We're not going to worry about Islandora 8 for this particular instance. And then, of course, you need to tell the module, the plugin, where to find your archive space. So we just go to the configuration form. We tell it where is it running. Like I said, this is a local installation of ArchivesSpace on the same box. So it's just localhost and the port 8089, or wherever your ArchivesSpace server is located, and a username and a password. Of course, a lot of the content in the ArchivesSpace API requires a username and password to get a hold of it. So what would make most sense for most users is to create a new ArchivesSpace user that just has read access, just to be safe, so that you then take that username and password, enter it here, so that we can read ArchivesSpace. And even though the module doesn't make any changes to ArchivesSpace, even if it tried, it wouldn't be able to. But for the purposes of demo, we're just going to use the one that comes with it, the admin one. Again, perfectly safe, but for security reasons, it usually makes sense to create a new username and password with read access to it. Before we pull stuff in, let's talk a little bit about what the module does. In Drupal, it's a content management system, so it's used for creating and managing content. Well, our archival descriptions are also types of content. And one of the things that Drupal allows us to do is define the different types of content we have, which is what we have with content types. You can think of a content type as just a collection of fields. So you have an archival object type of content that has things like a scope and content note, and it has a component identifier. And most of these fields are very similar to the archival resource, but there are a few differences, which is why they're 2 separate things. They are also different in the ArchivesSpace API, which makes sense to separate them here as well. We also have the top container content, a digital object content, and a repository object as well. As I mentioned, these all have different fields, so we've defined those fields in Drupal for you, which is where you have that ArchivesSpace defaults module, brings in all of these definitions of these different fields. And there's a lot of them. It continues down below this screenshot, but I wanted to give you a kind of feel for how these things look in Drupal. A lot of these are field types that come from Drupal, such as text. You know, it's a fairly standard thing. It's a large blob of text. But like ArchivesSpace, we can create references to other things. So when you're in ArchivesSpace and you select a subject, you're doing a lookup. Well, that's a reference. And so, for example, our classifications field right here is a reference to a classification that's defined as a bit of content somewhere else. And we'll be able to reference those two together. Now, courtesy of another module called controlled access terms, they've given us a special type of reference called the type relation. So when you create a agent link in ArchivesSpace, not only is it just a person that's linked, they have a type of relationship. Now, how Drupal would normally do this is create a different field for every type of relationship, but that would make a huge, huge content type trying to create all those types of relationships as fields. So we've created a special field type, a special relationship that allows us to type it just like ArchivesSpace does. The other ones that I want to call out here are that we have special data structures in ArchivesSpace that you don't see in other places. Yes, other systems have dates, but they normally don't have the concept of approximate dates, which we want to be able to support. And also extent. An extent isn't just a number of bytes or a number of disks or a number of folders. We have these typings along with it. Number of folders, number of digital objects, number of bytes, whatever it might be. So we did have to add that in with our code as well. This concept also applies for taxonomy. When you hear taxonomies or vocabularies in Drupal, think of it as your controlled access lists, where we are defining discrete agents or subjects that we want to be able to reference. So we have them, corporate body, family. This also comes from that controlled access terms module as well. And we can give these fields as well. So instead of just being a subject string or a person's name, we can add things like the birth date, death date, as we have in ArchivesSpace. So again, very much paralleling the ArchivesSpace data that we're going to bring over. Now, let's finally get around to loading this stuff in. We need to understand a few more concepts actually first. Drupal 8 provides, as a content management system, provides the structure for defining how to bring content into the content management system from external sites. So the Migrate API provides services for migrating data from something else into Drupal. And these source systems can be really anything. It could be an Islandora 7 instance. It could be a pile of scans in a CSV, which I use a lot. Or in our case, the REST API, which allows us to talk to ArchivesSpace. So this module has some custom code that allows it to authenticate with ArchivesSpace and speak the language of ArchivesSpace's API. But once we have that set up, it allows us to create maps between ArchivesSpace's data structure and the data structure as it's defined in Drupal, as we've defined it in Drupal. And because Drupal is very customizable, you can change these. So we've set a default, but if you want to change fields around, change how they're defined in Drupal, you can do that. And you can also adjust the configurations for the migrations as well to adjust how those are brought over. So we define a map of fields from each of the API endpoints to their counterpart in Drupal. And we can use a simple command like the migrate status command to have a look at, well, what are all of the records in the API for these different things, like a corporate body. There's 14 of them in my instance. There's 9 people in my ArchivesSpace. There is 8 resources, and there's 7,003 archival objects sitting in my ArchivesSpace waiting to come over. They're unprocessed. And then I just tell it to run, and it goes and it does it. Nothing else. It just runs and it brings them all over. So 14 corporate bodies, 9 people. It's creating all of these records in Drupal. You will note one interesting though, however, is that in this instance, 2 agents were ignored. And some of you might already be intuiting what's being ignored. Anything that doesn't have published setting on it. So for example, the admin user in ArchivesSpace has an agent record, but we don't publish it. There might be other things that you're currently working on that you're not ready to publish yet, that aren't published. We ignore those. We leave those in ArchivesSpace because you don't want them available yet. So we leave them behind. And so now in our Drupal, our plain vanilla Drupal, we now have a ArchivesSpace content. Here on the front page, we've just put out saying, hey, these are the newly published resource, ArchivesSpace resources. Howard Hughes, Professional Aeronautics, Vessel Sewage, and through the magic of television and not wanting to have to sit through 20 minutes of installing things and migrating, I already did it. So here's the ArchivesSpace with the resource records. Here is our new Drupal site with it freshly migrated in that we can look into. Now, of course, resources have more than titles, dates, and just an abstract. They are more fully formed. But what Drupal is doing is automatically saying, hey, you don't want to see all of that on the front page. You want to see a few fields. And so I'm going to create a teaser and show a bunch of teasers. And these are very easy to customize what fields are shown, how they're shown, what to show, however it might be. But we're going to click on Howard Hughes and see that, of course, all the ArchivesSpace data is here. Our dates, our identifiers, collection level. But we also have our Howard Hughes creator linked here. And if I click on Howard Hughes, I can see, well, here's all of his data as well. His preferred name, a link to the NACO authority file record. And if I clicked on that, it would take me to id.loc.gov. But also at the very bottom, it will show more of those teasers of the collections he is associated with. So this is really nice for users for navigating. So when they click on, hey, I'm interested in this person, it'll show what things are associated with that person rather than doing a search. Let's go back. Of course, the abstract, arrangement, all these notes. But also at the bottom, we have our inventory. Now this is built from what's called a view in Drupal, which is basically a query builder. So if you want to find data related to other data and sort it and filter it, it has a very, very powerful web interface for creating these views and displaying them in any number of ways. And that's what we've done here. We've said, hey, give me all of the archival objects that are related to this resource. Well, that includes aircraft photos, which of course it itself has subseries, such as the HK1 Hercules, and we can go down this tree. And another nice thing about Drupal is the breadcrumbs that have been built from it. So I can navigate this hierarchy as well. Of course, I can also go to subjects. Oh, sorry, that's the parent. Subjects are only at the resource level for this collection. We can go to our subjects, Hughes Aircraft Company, and see the collections that are associated with this subject as well. Oh, sorry, this is not a subject. This is a corporate body that is being used as a subject. Founding date, the solution date. I think these are actually all corporate bodies in this case. We do have subjects, but it's just not linked on this particular collection. But there they are. Also, your external refs are all brought in as well as linkable links to go out to other things. And there we go. And you say, okay, this is all great and dandy, but this is kind of ugly, or maybe I want to move fields around. Maybe I don't want the title where it is, the identifier where it is. How can I change this up? Well, we can log in and we can go into here, close, of course, that's a weak password. And I'm going to go to that content type. So for my archival objects, I can manage how they're displayed. So by default, I can move the order of fields around. I can just drag them all the way down to the bottom here to turn them off. Since I have breadcrumbs, I don't need to show the parent field, move them around. A lot of these different fields also have different formats that you can adjust from. These are fairly simple, but maybe you want your restrictions to be yes or no, or true or false, or on, off, enabled, disabled, or something else. You can do a lot of that customizability right here. Well, maybe you want a completely different theme. There are a lot of themes that are available in for Drupal sites all over the place, not except I want appearance. And I've installed one of them called Solid. So I'm just going to say, hey, let's use that one instead. And go back to my site. It'll take another minute because I have to think about all the new styling that's there. Oh, it went back to my user. Let's go to our home. And you can see it's a very different, let me log out actually. Oh, the log out button is different on this one. But anyway, Howard Hughes. There's a description, very different look and feel for Howard Hughes here. So very easy to customize what you're looking at. There's a lot of power here, so it can get a little bit bewildering, but there's a lot there. These are just screenshots in case something blew up on me. So, of course, you are constantly creating new descriptions, right? Or you're updating things because you've discovered a little bit more information. You want to update your scope and content node. Well, how do we tell Drupal that you have updates? The Migrate API has some built-in update capabilities, and some of the existing Migrate tools are very simple to use. You just add an update flag to it, and it just updates. But when you get to massive sites, sometimes those die. So we've built some web forms and some commands that actually make this much more efficient for large sites. So from the command line, you can do drush ArchivesSpace update, and it'll go and bring in all of the updates. If you want to get rid of stuff that's deleted, well, drush ArchivesSpace purge will get rid of things that you've deleted from your site. And now what I would actually recommend you do, and if you want to just do this, you know, from the UI, there's pages for doing updates. Although what I would recommend, just like you have your system administrator doing regular backups on an automated basis, you can put this command into that same repeating fashion and say, update every 5 minutes if you wanted to. Maybe you only want to bring in updates once a week. You can do that too. Very easy to have this refresh on a regular basis. So you just set it and forget it and just let it run. As I mentioned, customization, you can rearrange things. So I jumped again on that when I got too excited about how easy it is to change these things. You can change fields around. You can change the theming to change how it looks. This is another extreme example. This looks very different from the others before it, but it's the same content. We have the breadcrumbs, we have the titles. We hid some of the more administrative things in collapsible fields so that you can just click on this and expand it or contract it. We also put our inventory, instead of a table at the bottom, it's on the sidebar with this sliding scale. So you can slide it to the right or to the left if you want to make your inventory listing bigger as well. Eventually, we're going to make this the clickable expand like the ArchivesSpace PUI has, but we haven't done that quite yet. One of the things that I should have shown you before, but we didn't, is that I did also bring over a digital object. that I have defined. A photograph of Hughes' flying boat, wing under construction, which is on the right side of the screen. And of course, it links back to its archival object, which is on the left. But as an oversight, I admit this is my fault. I didn't put in by default a way to go from the archival object to its digital object instance like I did the physical instance. This is in part my oversight because I'm using the Islandora one, not the default one standalone. So that is my bad. But within about 5 minutes, you can update the archival object to show the thumbnail of the digital object on the side. If we have time for Q&A and people want to see me do that live, I can do that live in like 5 minutes if we have the time for that at the end, if there's sufficient time with questions. But it's so easy to move data around and to query data and to do other things with it and do all sorts of things with it by being in Drupal. So, of course, you're asking, well, what about this? What about Islandora? So one of the reasons why the Islandora default doesn't have as robust digital object is because it's kind of up in the air how people will want to do digital objects with Islandora, because there's two big ideas that you could use here. The first one is to do something just like ArchivesSpace does, and what I think a lot of people are used to. So this is kind of the standard default paradigm that people are thinking to, in that you have one record for your archival object, and you have a completely separate and distinct descriptive record for its digitized counterpart. There's a lot of archival theory behind why that metadata theory about why that makes sense. In part, it allows for different metadata fields. It allows you to more easily control the display for one versus the other. The complication with this model, however, is that it creates what a user might see as duplicate results as far as the user is concerned. So for example, in our site, we have this wonderful conceptual drawing of Mobots. On the left side here, we've done a search for Mobots, and we have two results because we have two separate records for what most users would think of as the same thing. We have the archival description, the archival component, and we have the digital object description that was done by our digital collections team. They are both separate, distinct metadata records, so they both show up in the search. However, if I'm a person walking off the street and I happen to search Mobots and see two different records, I might expect that they're two different, intellectually different things. Think of it as the difference between two different, I'm trying to remember the dev frame for this, two different works, or two different instances of the same work. I don't remember. I don't do dev frame, sorry. But anyway, they're the same drawing. One's digital, one's not. It might be a bit confusing. We do, however, try to link them back and forth. So the archival component does link to the digital object, and the digital object does link back to the archival component, but it's potentially confusing. An alternative is you could have just a single descriptive record. The archival object is the descriptive record, and you just attach the digital object, the digital content to it directly. So if you know the ArchivesSpace interface, you know how we have the digital object and you have the file instances. Imagine if you moved those file instances directly onto the archival object. That's kind of what we're thinking about right here. We have a single descriptive record and you have those, file instances rather than a digital object instance. And this would create a single page for both the physical object and the digital instances, potentially reduces the perception of duplicate results. We don't have people using this yet, so we haven't come to a community consensus on this. And either one makes sense depending on your perspective. So version 1.0 is available. Yay, it was released yesterday, actually. So what's next? There's plenty still that we can do. First of all, you may know that Drupal is transitioning from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 now. This causes some people to panic. Don't panic. Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 is a big change, a big architecture change. A lot of things change between the two. Between Drupal 8 and Drupal 9, very little changes. So think of this as the difference between going between ArchivesSpace 1 and 2 was a fairly somewhat significant change, but going between 2.6 and 2.7 is a very small change. That's what the change between Drupal 8 and 9 is. This is essentially a minor version upgrade, not a big revamping, and we're almost ready. The only thing holding ArchivesSpace module back from being Drupal 9 ready right now is one of the modules that, the dependencies, one of the other modules that we use needs to be updated or replaced. So, and that's it. We're almost ready for that. The one thing that I would like to really get working better is searching for dates. One of the nice things about the search interface in Drupal is that it has this little date slider. So you can say, show me only content between these two dates. But because of the way that we do approximation of dates, it's not immediately available to us. I'm going to fix that. It's going to come. I'm going to be working on that shortly. So that's going to be next. It would also be nice to be able to sort our inventories by extent. So show me the subseries with the most stuff in it. The complication there is figuring out how to say what's the most stuff, because simply one folder versus 1 cubic foot is a very different thing. So we need to be able to teach the computer how to sort those different types of materials in terms of quantity. So still need to work on that. But if you don't need it, it works fine just now. I would also like to better support printable PDFs, because some people still like to print the full finding aid. That stated, some finding aids are massive. We have at least one finding aid at UNLV that when printed is like 1,000 pages long. And if you try to do that on the fly, it just crashes. This is true in ArchivesSpace. This is true, would be true in Drupal if we tried to do it wholly on the Drupal data. It's just too big to do without using some sort of backend process. So I can already take a PDF and post it on the resource content type. That's already done. I can do that now. I would like to help automate this to say, hey, I noticed that the archival object associated with this resource has changed. We need to refresh our PDF and automate that process. So that will be coming eventually. It's something I would like to work on. Other things that could be worked on, but we'll see what the community wants, is a little bit better subject import options. For example, Drupal has the notion of hierarchy with taxonomies. So you can say, hey, this subject term is a child of that subject term. And what we could do is you could say, hey, I have the topic Las Vegas, but I also have Las Vegas history or Las Vegas something else. Nesting those together, because that enables some real good power with searching to say, hey, I'm interested in Las Vegas, but I also want you to include in my search all these other subject terms that are children of it as well. So being able to pull that in more automatically would be nice. Also sorting things between subjects versus geographic locations. We have some of that already. It could be more sophisticated, let's say. And also improve digital object support. Again, actually not again, I haven't really mentioned this before. For digital objects, we, using Islandora, we're going to use Islandora for our description there, because there's a lot already tooled in and it works well. We don't need the digital object description aspect of ArchivesSpace. So we're just going to do it there. For that reason, I haven't put in a ton of time supporting it very well for bringing over those digital object descriptions. It's good enough for an initial import, but further updating and working, it could probably use some support. But that depends if people want it. So if people start using it and say, hey, we want better support, we could certainly improve that. That said, questions?
Thank you, Seth. That was really great. We do have some questions, so we're going to go ahead and start plowing away through those. If you have a question, again, please do type it into the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. A copy of that Q&A is what will be provided with the recording of this webinar and the webinar slides, and what will be made available on our website. So we want to make sure we're using the Q&A option. And if someone asks a question and you have some insight or some experience and you want to weigh in, please feel free to comment on that question. But we're going to go ahead and dive in. First question from Catherine. UNLV, if I understand you correctly, has replaced the ASpace public-facing interface with the Drupal interface. But couldn't an institution keep their public-facing ASpace UI and at the same time use the Drupal module in their public-facing IR using Islandora 8?
Absolutely. There's nothing saying that you have to get rid of the PUI. In fact, we still have ours enabled because our new site is not live yet. So it's not public. We do have an older access interface and search and discovery interface that we're still actively using while we finish the touches on this new site. But I do know that some of our staff like having the ArchivesSpace PUI to show individuals of note things that are in progress that are not in the public, aren't in the new site or in our existing sites as well. So you can certainly do that totally fine.
Thanks. Bailey asks, and I think she adds, I think this has now been answered, but just to clarify, I saw a finding a link field on the Howard Hughes resource in the Drupal UI. What does that link lead to, and how is it different from what is displayed on the resource page?
Okay. That finding aid link comes directly from the finding aid URL. Oh, what's that field? I can never remember the names of fields right off the top of my head, but I can show you really quick. Let's view Vassal Sewage because I'm sure it has it. Oh, of course I've timed out. Let's go back to our, yes, I know it's a bad password. Resources, to Vassal Sewage. I think it's like EAD location. It's in the finding a data section. I'll say that much. Yeah, this one right here. EAD location maps to that finding aid link. We've used that for our ARCs because we started doing ARCs before ARCs were available in ArchivesSpace. So we may or may not change that, how that works. But there we go. That's that.
Thanks. Nancy says, thanks so much for the demo. Occasionally we have very long series. How does your Drupal site handle situations where the inventory is very long, a series with more than 1,000 or 3,000 direct children? And relatedly, is the search box scoped to the current collection or series?
Okay, very good. So the search box, I haven't played with that at all with this particular site. So this is just going to search everything. You can build a search that is scoped to a collection. That is totally doable. I just don't have it set up here. I haven't done anything special with this particular search. So I do know that in aircraft photographs, in the Hercules photographs, we have several pages. We have 6 pages of results for this. As you probably know, if you have giant inventories, if you try to show them all, it's going to crash the site. So we add things like pagers to make it more sustainable so they don't crash. There is a fun little Drupal module called Views Infinite Scroll. So you know when you go to a social media site like Twitter and you keep scrolling and it pops up more results as you scroll? If you enable that module, the Infinite Scroll module, and change a few settings on the inventory, it'll do that. Where if I scroll down to the bottom of the inventory, it'll just keep dropping more and more items onto the inventory as I scroll down. It is very slick, very cool module. But again, I didn't have to build it. Someone else built it for Drupal. So yes, the more we can reuse stuff from other sites, that's one of the reasons for doing it here.
Thanks. Bailey has asked that you show how to connect DOs to records. So maybe let's save like 5 minutes at the end for that. Is that cool, Seth?
Yep. Yeah.
So Bailey, we are going to do that, but we're going to go ahead and address these other questions in the chat. Kristen asked, how do users request physical materials through the Drupal module in version 1.0? Our current ASpace PUI links out from the resources and archival objects to our Aeon request interface. Not sure how requests for materials are submitted at UNLV.
Okay, so we do not have Aeon. All of our requests are through emails right now. So how we could do that here is we could build a little email link that says, hey, email a request for this particular collection. That stated, a lot of Drupal sites are e-commerce sites. So if you wanted to use like an e-commerce shopping cart type feature and add on shopping carts to things and have someone put an order, and you could integrate this with Aeon fairly simply, I imagine. I'll couch that with I imagine. But we don't use Aeon, so I haven't really given any thought into how you would be able to do this with Aeon, unfortunately.
Thanks, Seth. And I do know we have some people in attendance that do use Aeon. So if there's any thoughts, again, feel free to weigh in the question in the chat. Another question from Troy. This one's about Content DM. So again, if we have any Content DM users who want to weigh in. At Mississippi State University, we are new to ArchivesSpace and our digital collections are in Content DM. Is it possible to integrate in the same way you showed with Islandora?
Yes. So there's two ways that you can think about this. We currently have Content DM. We are replacing Content DM with Islandora 8. So if you want to do that, you could. The other option is to create, to bring in those digital objects, but instead of using the file instances as direct copies, because this example, this copies the files from wherever they are into Drupal, you could just have references to the Content DM files and use that API to talk with it. So you could do that. That would probably take a little bit more work for the digital objects, depending on how you wanted to set it up. But you could certainly do an integration with Content DM with this as well. That stated, we are moving away, but I would be happy to chat with you about how you could do that.
Cool, thanks, Seth. One more question in the chat from Matt. If we already have a database of museum objects in a Drupal database, is there any possibility of importing it into ArchivesSpace?
So not with, so I would say you could, not with this module. This is a one way. This is just pulling content from ArchivesSpace into Drupal. That stated, Drupal has a lot of power for creating serializations of your content. So you could build the other direction to update ArchivesSpace. It would be a conversation about how to do that, but there's no one click for this to turn it the other direction right now.
Yeah, thanks. And Tommy adds, no, that's one directional, but you could export the data from Drupal using other tools like the JSON API or views and import them into ArchivesSpace using one of the import options for ArchivesSpace.
Yeah, exactly. Tommy has it.
So, we did just get another question in the chat. Josh asks, what's a guesstimate on the import time for many published objects, like more than 250,000?
Excellent question. So there's some variables to consider here. One is how quick is your network between the two sites, because the biggest limiting factor really is the network speed between the two, because that's a lot of requests, a lot of data going over the network. Another consideration is how quick your database is. You're going to be a lot of data to a database when you do that. That stated, Josh, our production archive space is about the same size. We have I noted this somewhere. Where do I have that? Anyway, yeah, we have like over 300,000 archival objects in our ArchivesSpace instance right now. An initial import of just the agents and the subjects and the resources records takes like 3 minutes, like virtually nothing. Archival objects and top containers, on the other hand, take a whole lot longer, like 2-3 hours sometimes for the initial import. That stated, that's the initial import. Updates could be just, a minute or less, depending on how quickly you are doing updates on your ArchivesSpace site. So the initial import, you would want to do, off hours on the initial setup of the site. But it's one of those things where you set it up, let it run, come back later after you've had lunch, and it's done.
Thanks, Seth. That was the last question in the chat. So yeah, if you want to go ahead and do that demo.
Yeah, like I mentioned, under a lot of what you can do is based off of the views, which is basically a query builder. And you can see that there's already a bunch of different views built in already. For example, the archival object children, that's how we do our inventories lists. That's set up there. We also do have a way to show all of the items, archival objects that are associated with a box. That is another view. So let's add another view. We're going to call this digital object. Not the greatest name, but hey, it's there. And we do want to show digital objects. I'm going to create this as a block. Save and edit. Now, one of the things that took me a while to realize how to use it is that we want to have this show the digital object that's associated with just the item we're looking at. And if you want to have that capability, you need to enable what's referred to as a contextual filter. So we are going to build a query that's going to be filtered based off of what I'm currently looking at. So this is a little bit of you get used to what's going on here. And it does take some time, and I may write some tutorials about how to do this better. But I do know that the digital object has a field called source that has that reference to the archival object that it was digitized from. So that is going to be the filter I'm going to use, is where the digital object came from. And I want to get that value. You can get that value of that relationship from a lot of different places, but I'm going to get it from the actual URL, the page that I'm looking at right now. Apply. So again, it only takes 5 minutes for me because I've become familiar with how this stuff works, but that's how it goes. We can even test this really quick. We lost the site. Let's open this site back in the site. This was, it was actually this one. So I'm going to say, hey, I know this is going to be page 628. I'm just going to test this really quick. I'm going to preview this to see if it works. And right now, it just shows the title, which, isn't that great. Instead of showing just a list of fields, I'm going to tell it to show me my teaser. So I'm going to tell it to show me the content in the teaser mode, and I can define any different sets of combinations of fields and settings that I want to show. Teaser is the easy one. So like I said, you can go really deep in how sophisticated you want this to be. So I want to find all the digital objects that are published associated with this item. It's going to look like this. If I had done fields, I could have showed the description or whatever it might be, but we're just going to say we're going to be good with this and save it. And now we just need to tell Drupal where to put this view. It's going to be block layout. And do I want to put this above the content? Do I want to put it in a sidebar? Where do I want to put it? I actually already had one, apparently. I should have just enabled it. But anyway, that's where it is. Let's just delete it because I want to show you the new one I made. Remove. Let's find the new one I just made. Put it in the sidebar, place block. We called it digital object. So I already did this once. I'm doing it again. I want to show it on my archival objects. So there it is. Save it and go back to my site. Oh, wait, I wasn't on that same page. Construction, there it is on the side. And 4 minutes to do that. Again, we can customize this all we want. We can tell it to, so back here, we saw that it was showing digital object, even though there's no digital object associated with it. That's actually an easy fix. Back to my digital object view. I just want to tell it to hide the block if there's nothing in there. Save. Let's go back to that page. Oh wait, it was the parent that didn't have it. There, the block's hidden. So yeah, really, really flexible. A lot of power here just through the point and click interface. I didn't do a drop of code there to make that work.
Awesome. Thank you, Seth. Look at that time. That was perfect. We haven't gotten any other questions in the chat. Bailey says, excellent, thank you for that. Since we don't have any other questions in the chat, I'll go ahead and thank you, Seth, again. Thank you to everyone who stuck around till the bitter end with us. And I look forward to seeing all of you again at the next ArchivesSpace webinar.